Thank you so much, Irina, and your team for having me. As she introduced me, my name is Sewa. I'm so excited to be with you all today. Thank you so much for having me. I'm so grateful for the work you are doing in advocating, translating for domestic violence victims. It's such an important work, and so grateful for your time and for your commitment. So a little bit about me. I live in Atlanta, but I'm originally from India. I've lived in Atlanta for about 23 years, and I have a daughter, Ellie, and she's 11 years old. She is the joy of my life, and she's also becoming preteen now, so we're in like a whole new phase of parenting with her, which has been interesting, but I'm so grateful for our life and for just the beauty in our life today, because our life wasn't always like this. Years ago, this was not our story. Actually, the story starts about 23 years ago when I moved here to the US. I was just 18 years old, so you can do the math of that if you'd like to calculate my age. I was young and full of life and ready to take on the world. It was my freshman year of college, and the cute boy that worked in the shop right next to me had asked me out on a date. He told me that I was the prettiest and the smartest girl he had ever met. He gave me everything that I was looking for in that season: attention, praise, even financial help, a cell phone. 23 years ago, those were brand new. And, I had one of those that was like massive, those big black ones. I don't know if any of you all had those. He took me to new places in his cool car. I was enamored by him. But most importantly, he gave me security. You see, I was new to the US. I was an immigrant. I didn't have a lot of money. I had very few friends at the time. And because I was vulnerable, I didn't see those early warning signs, that all the attention that he was giving me was actually a need for control, to make sure I only wanted to be with him, that I only needed him. And what I thought was, oh, he really loves me and he wants to be with me, was actually an isolation tactic to keep me from having other people in my life. But in that season of my life, what I wanted and really needed was security. And I wanted to feel like everything was going to be okay. And I felt that with him by my side, I was safe. But safe is not a word I would ascribe to him years later when we were married. Suddenly, things changed. I couldn't do anything right. I had lost my place on that pedestal he had put me on. Everything I did or I didn't do was not good enough now for him, was a new point of frustration for him. And I felt like everything was my fault. And I felt like it was not only with him, but even for myself eventually. I couldn't be good enough even for me. He was suspicious of me constantly. I felt like I was walking on eggshells in my own home. And in those years, my self-worth really took a new low. I was often worried about what would happen next, what would be the next thing that would be a point of frustration for him. Years into the marriage, this emotional and verbal abuse turned into physical violence. And it wasn't always physical abuse like you might imagine. It was sometimes intimidation, just the feeling of being scared that I could be harmed. Sometimes it was physical, and there were times I did get hurt. At its worst, he carried a gun in the house every time I was home to show me that he was armed. An actual physical threat to harm me in the midst of when we were in a separation. In those days, my mind was a blur. I was barely surviving. I was scared. And I could not tell anyone for the fear that the abuse would escalate in our home. I didn't tell anyone for years because I truly believed that things could get better. Because you see, leaving was the furthest option that I could even consider. I grasped for anything that could give me hope. I longed for good days in our marriage because there were actually a lot of good days. We would go months and weeks without any incident in our home. And I think that's one of the myths of domestic violence, and of homes that have domestic violence in them, is that not every day is a bad day. Um, their abusers have a good side, and then they also have a toxic side. Um, and in actuality, abusers, like all people, are complex and layered. Um, and they essentially, abusers are people who have unhealed trauma from their past. And since abuse is a mindset of control and power, they believe that control is the only way that they can feel secure in the relationship. So essentially, abuse comes from a place of deep insecurity and trauma that they have faced. But in reality, abusers are real people with real hurts, and hurts that have manifested themselves as a pattern of control and power. So we don't condone these actions, but I think it's important for us to realize that there's a root cause to abuse. And in my marriage, it was very much the same way. We had lots of good days, and then there would be days when he would begin to criticize, berate me, and eventually it would turn to physical violence. But then, just like the cycle of abuse, there was an apology, and everything would be better for a while. And then the cycle would start all over again. This went on for years. And I held on hope, hoping that things would get better. But I think in my mind, I still hadn't identified that this was the cycle of abuse, that I was in it. Until one day, once again, there was a simple misunderstanding, and it turned into this massive argument. And when he wasn't getting his way, he stood over me to intimidate me to be quiet. And I heard a little cry from the playpen beside me. It was my 2-year-old daughter. I looked at her, into her eyes, and her eyes had fear in them, something I hadn't seen before. And something in me in that moment shifted. I knew that I couldn't keep her in that type of environment. I knew that this wasn't going to be good for her long term. But I also realized that this isn't what I deserved, that what I deserved was a place of safety. And I deserved to be protected and cared for by the person I trusted the most. And so having this realization, of course, as typical as it is for a lot of domestic violence situations, I didn't immediately leave the home. I was still figuring things out. And so in the weeks ahead, when we had another incident, I finally had the courage to break my silence. I called a friend, a close friend, and I told her what was going on. And of course, like any good friend, she immediately went into action and asked me to call the police. She lived out of state. She asked me to call the police. That was terrifying, but I did it. And in that moment, I think I was extremely scared, but I also had this sense of empowerment for the first time, that I had taken this bold step to speak up and speak out for what was going on inside my home. And it was, I think, the first time I realized that I was not to blame and that I deserved better. And I think seeing his reaction to that also let me know that the situation in our home was not going to change anytime soon. But even then, it still took me another 2 years to leave our marriage. So what a lot of people don't know about domestic violence is that you can't just leave, even if you know you should, and you can't just leave. It's easy for an outsider to look at a victim and say that, like, if you're being hurt, you should immediately walk out. But there's so many complexities around leaving and staying. It's almost like you lose if you stay and you lose if you leave. There's really no good option for victims. Essentially, victims have a strong emotional attachment to their abusive partners. They sincerely love them and they want to see a good side to them. And then outside of the emotional attachment they have, they also are dependent on their partners, oftentimes financially dependent on their partners. This dependency, all of these factors is what usually keeps victims in the home, but it also keeps abuse thriving when the perpetrator knows that the victim is completely dependent on them. Now, like in situations with immigrants who are dependent on their abusers for visas, it's even more complex because the abuser knows that the victim needs to be able to stay in the country if there's children involved, especially. And so that can oftentimes be held over the abuser to keep them quiet and keep them in the marriage. I believe one of the biggest reasons why victims don't leave, outside of all of these things, although they're all major factors, is that to leave, you have to have strong self-worth. And self-worth is the one thing that victims often lack. You see, in order for a victim to take the courageous step to leave an abusive situation, you have to believe that you deserve better, that you're worthy of more, that you are independent and capable to stand on your own 2 feet and do life without the abuser. And in an abusive situation, your self-worth is constantly taking a hit. And so oftentimes victims don't believe that they're actually worthy of a different life that's going to give them freedom. Oftentimes they don't even realize that there is a new life out there for them because maybe all they've known is that relationship. And like me, since I met him so young, I also, I think for a while, did not realize that I could actually live without him and build my own life without him. And so, as I mentioned earlier, it took me about 2 years to finally leave, to finally go through a separation. And after those 2 years, I finally took my things, moved out of the home. I started over. I had very little to my name at that time, but I was out, and to me, that's all that mattered. I had fought a long and hard battle for my freedom and custody for my daughter in the court systems. I didn't get full custody as I should have. And if you truly consider the gravity of a domestic violence situation, these cases should actually be tried in criminal court, where the abuser's actions should lead to criminal charges. Unfortunately, this is rarely the case, especially here in the US. Abusers and victims are often pinned against one another in family court, and their divorce is treated like any other case with irreconcilable differences. So, unfortunately, the victim's point of view and the abuser's point of view are equally considered in a lot of these court cases. And oftentimes, judges will look favorably on the abuser who shows that they're willing to change, that they want to have a part of their children's life. And the court systems largely believe that it is good and positive for children to have access to both parents. And while that is true in most situations, what's different in domestic violence cases is that children are then often used as pawns to keep control and tabs over the partner. And those children are often further exposed to abuse and toxic behaviors throughout their childhood because of their custody. And another interesting factor is that Oftentimes abusers will show this confident and charismatic demeanor in court, while the victim oftentimes seems weak or frail. And perpetrators are often given the benefit of the doubt. It's very interesting. While the burden of the proof is on the victim, who must prove that beyond a shadow of a doubt, these violations have taken place before the courts will move to protect the victim and her children. And unfortunately, as we know, proof of abuse is one thing that victims rarely have. Because if not all abuse takes place behind closed doors, where there is no way to document and there's no witnesses. And so as a result, a lot of abusers gain partial or sometimes full or sole custody of their children, leaving children in vulnerable and often dangerous situations without the other parent now to help protect them. So I think it's, for when I think about the work that you all do, I thought about, depending on where the victim is in their stage of leaving, it could be helpful to help a victim figure out a plan of safety. And I have some information on my website regarding this that I can give to Irina. But helping them create a method of documentation, a plan of safety would be useful if they're still currently living with the abuser. Even if they don't have proof of abuse, it would be good for them to document the specifics of the abuse, the dates, times, circumstances around it, so that if they do have to give a testimony, they would be well prepared to do so. It would also be helpful to get signed affidavits from close friends and family who can attest to the trustworthiness and reliability of the victim. These are some of the things that I wish I would have known when I was when I was in the courts dealing with all of these things. I wish I would have had an advocate or someone that would have given me clear guidance on what to do and how to document. And these were some of the dynamics that I myself had to deal with in my divorce and that many survivors have to deal with. For me, not only this, but there was after effects of the abuse that still loomed over me. I was dealing with post-traumatic stress from years of trauma. When I first left, I thought, okay, the abuse is over, I'm safe. But the truth is, the pain of the past and the anxiety of everything that happened to me was still living inside my body. Even though I was physically safe and away from him, I was still scared. So what we know now from research is that trauma lives inside of our body. And our body is still not able to, even when we are physically safe, our mind knows we're physically safe, our body still doesn't understand safety. It's still living in that place of fight or flight mode. And so I was still scared, even though I was away from him. So I had a lot of triggers in those early days. If there was any sudden loud noises, if there was any uninvited touch, like, when you have a small child, right? As you know, children will just touch you or grab you or come up behind you, anything like that would put my body in severe stress or severe anxiety, and in that fight or flight mode. And so in that season, I had severe anxiety and I had severe depression and had left me completely worn out. And one day I was just in my apartment and I stood in the kitchen of my apartment and I thought, if this is the way my life is going to be, I just don't want to live anymore. And I even started creating a plan because I had hit such a low place. I think this moment for me was such a culmination of all the years of trauma I had been through. But not only that, I think it had been a culmination of years of shame that I had put on myself, because a lot of domestic violence victims feel that the abuse was their fault, that they should have stayed, should have left, that now this is going to define who they are. Even after they leave, they don't really feel free. And so I had these lies that I had believed in my mind about myself. about my identity, who I was, that I'm abused, I'm a divorcee, I'm broken, I'm not worthy of real love, that my abuse will define me, that this will be the single story of my life, and that I had nothing to offer this world, or that my life will amount to nothing. And of course, I didn't know at the time that these things were just lies and places of shame in my mind. But I believed these things in my heart, and I didn't know how to move forward. But in the days ahead, I realized that I needed significant help if I was going to survive and build a new life ahead. And when I look back on that day 7 years ago, I've come a long way, and I've learned a few things about healing along the way. I'd just like to share a few of those with you. So for me, what I realized is that healing is going to take grit and perseverance. It will not be linear. Healing is circular. So your point of pain is a point on that circle, and you will keep coming back to it over and over again. But as you heal, every time you circle back to that point of pain, you will feel better. You will be wiser, you will be stronger than you were before. But that point of pain will always remain with you. Just over time, it will not be as present and triggering and overpowering in your life as it was before. And so in order to heal, you have to be willing to lean into that pain. And that takes a lot of courage to be able to do that. And sometimes healing will be harder than the wound itself. You'll just want to go back to the dysfunction because it's easier than creating new patterns in your brain. And oftentimes we see this with domestic violence victims. Either they go into another domestic violence situation with a new relationship because what they know is dysfunction. And so that since that is their comfort zone, that's going to be the new relationship that they may take on. Or creating a new world is so difficult that it's easier just to go back to the abuser and go back to that place of trauma again, because that's all that they know. Healing for me, in order to be able to move forward with a new life, meant going to therapy, and not just any type of therapy. It was to a trauma-informed therapy, and learning ways on how to rewire my brain from the trauma pathways that it had created. So I went to therapy called EMDR, and essentially what it does is that it helps you reprocess your trauma in a safe environment, and hence close it out of your body, so your body is not triggered by that trauma as much as it was before. Healing for me was not just with therapy, although that was so helpful, but it was also transitioning out any toxic community in my life that was going to cause additional triggers for me, and it was not going to people that were not going to help me grow. So what I realized, one interesting thing about divorce and starting over, is that it's a chance for you to kind of start over with new people as well, because oftentimes in divorce situations, you kind of lose people, you lose friendships a lot. And so this was kind of my time to evaluate who were the people in my life that were truly good and healthy and wise people. And these are the people I needed to keep in my life, and everyone else I needed to transition out to a place where they didn't have as much access to me anymore. I needed to have people in my life who were wise and trustworthy and gracious. And I think what I also realized is that it's also people who are working on their own self and maybe on their own healing, because if people don't care about their own healing, they certainly won't care about yours. I also dived into a lot of community resources like divorce care groups through my church, codependency groups to help me identify what my own patterns were, and then that helped me move towards a new normal. Because if ever I was going to get remarried and try this again, I needed to identify what were my patterns that caused me to get into an unhealthy relationship to begin with that I wasn't now going to continue. So for me, these were the cornerstones of my healing. I still work through them today, and I'm always a work in progress, as all of us are. When I think back to that day 7 years ago, and the story that could have been told of my life would have been of tragedy. But instead of giving up, I held on to hope. And sometimes when you're in the pit of despair, all you need is a little hope, just a little light at the end of the tunnel that things are going to be okay. I held on to hope that this was not going to be the end of the road for me. Hope that there was something going to be better on the other side of healing for my daughter and I. I honestly didn't know what that better was going to be. I held on to hope that somehow this story and everything that happened to me was going to matter for something good and greater that was beyond me. And what I can tell you now, 7 years later, is that hope is what kept me going. And the things I have hoped for have truly come to fruition. And I really believe that as a friend, family member, and advocate to victims, we too can offer hope in the midst of their darkest trials. We can believe their stories. We can be a listening ear. We can understand that their pain is valid. But we can assure them that this hard story will not be the defining story of their life. This is part of their journey, but they still have a chance to build a beautiful life and have a story worth telling. At the end of the day, it's important to focus on who you want to be, the story you want to write, and the person you're going to be proud of when you look back on this. That was my story, and when I look back now, I'm truly grateful because I know that I had resources and support that a lot of domestic violence victims do not have. And I think it's one of the biggest reasons why I talk about this topic today, because I want to build an awareness on why domestic violence happens in the home, but also what can we do to make sure that domestic violence victims are seen and known. Just to give you a broader perspective of domestic violence before I close. So as you know, domestic violence is a pattern of control and power that is exerted from one person to another. It can happen, and it does happen, in every race, in every religion, in every economic status. Anyone can be a victim. Women, men, children. And domestic violence not only affects families, but it also affects our society as a whole. So trauma in the home and in children especially is the leading cause of anxiety, depression, and suicide. It's also one of the #1 reasons why children are placed in the foster care system. So not only that, domestic violence is at the core of mass shootings. Well, in our country for sure, because we have a major issue with mass shootings, but also in countries around the world. Statistics show that 50% of domestic violence, 50% of mass shooters had a prior history of domestic violence in their homes. So in this way, we can see that domestic violence has permeated our homes, our mental health, our society as a whole. And so I really believe it's time for us to pay attention. We can't remain silent or apathetic on this issue any longer. And our awareness and action can truly save the lives of a woman or a child or even a man. And what you are doing, your voice even matters. How you use your platform to raise awareness matters. How you help a friend who is struggling with abuse matters for her and for her future. The fact that you serve and donate to any local shelters or domestic violence organizations makes a huge difference in the lives of women and children who are struggling. And I truly believe that we're all in this together, and together we can really make this a safer world for all of us. Thank you. Appreciate you having me.